Anybody that didn't receive the notes from page 29 onward, if your notes only go to 28, then you didn't get the last pages of this series. Okay, looks like everybody has a copy. Right, we're down on page 35 in your notes, down in the middle of the page. Okay, we're going to be looking at the doctrine of resurrection. The doctrine of resurrection. So we'll start with the definition as we've looked at all these doctrines. The previous 13, we've given a definition for each doctrine, and so for the doctrine of resurrection, our definition is to be physically and bodily raised from the dead. So we're not talking about a spiritual resurrection here. We're talking about a physical, bodily resurrection from the dead. And so we want to begin looking at general references, both in the Old and New Testament, concerning resurrection. So resurrection was not something new introduced in the New Testament. The concept of a physical, bodily resurrection from the dead was revealed in the Old Testament. They're general references, so they're not specific, and certainly not specific concerning the timing. Although there's a hint of a timing in the reference in Daniel. But let's start with the book of Job. Let's turn to the book of Job, chapter 19. Job chapter 19, and would someone like to read verses 25 through 27? Okay, so just to have a little background of the book of Job, there's good indication that Job was written, the book of Job was written early on, very early on. There's good evidence that Job lived probably around the time of Abraham. So we read about Abraham as early as Genesis chapter 12. We have a record of his life from Genesis 12 all the way through chapter 24. I think chapter 25 is his death. So we have quite a record there of the life of Job. And of Abraham in Genesis 12 through 24. And Job, there's good evidence that Job lived around that time, and Abraham living around 2000 BC. And so Job, then, if he indeed lived around the time of Abraham, well, he would have had very little information, very little revelation from God. Maybe he had, the first 10 chapters of Genesis in a scroll. He may have had access to those early chapters in Genesis. But it's very clear in Job chapter 19, Job's words in verses 25 to 27, that Job had the information, revelation that was apparently passed on verbally from God to Adam, and then from Adam it got passed down from generation to generation to Job, that he has a knowledge of a resurrection, a physical, bodily resurrection from the dead. And not only that, but he also has information concerning the Redeemer in verse 25. And what specifically, what information did Job have about the Redeemer in verse 25? I didn't quite hear. Okay, the Redeemer liveth. And what else? He's going to stand at the latter day upon the earth. What does that mean? Okay, so Job had knowledge that the Redeemer was going to come. So in light of future events, in light of eschatology, the last days or the last things, Job had knowledge that the Redeemer was going to come. And where was the Redeemer going to stand in the latter day? Upon the earth. Well, that's certainly spiritual, right? Why? Why would it be spiritual? Why not take it as it says? It says he's going to stand at the latter day upon the earth. So Job had, and I think we ought to take this literally exactly as written. God means what he says what he means. And so Job had knowledge concerning the coming of the Lord, and considering the fact, again, that Job may have had the first 10 chapters of Genesis, but yet he had this knowledge. Blake? Mm-hmm. I think in light of the New Testament scriptures that we now have, I think that would be in light of his second coming. Yeah, his second advent. Because that's when, of course, we know, according to Zechariah, that's when he's going to stand upon the earth. Mammy?
Just a thought, but I wonder, it said that after the Lord's resurrection, like to the two on the road to Emmaus, he opened up into them the scriptures concerning it. Mm-hmm. I wonder if he maybe touched on this one.
Yeah. Yeah, that would certainly have been an intriguing conversation to listen in on, because he went through the Old Testament scriptures and explained how they spoke of him. And so he would have gone through, obviously, all the messianic prophecies. And yeah, this could have been indeed one of them. So notice now getting into resurrection. Notice in verse number 26, what is the wording that Job gives here that would tell us that he's talking about a physical bodily resurrection? Kathy?
In my flesh, I shall see God.
Right. In my flesh, I shall see God. And that's after he says, though after my skin worms destroy this body. Right? Isn't that what happens when we die? Our bodies decay. All that's left is the bones. So there's no flesh left. And so after death, after that happens, the natural process of decaying, he says, yet in my flesh I shall see God. So Job had confidence that one day after he died, he would have a physical bodily resurrection, and in that body, he would see God. So Job knew of a resurrection. And so if Job knew of a resurrection, then those living in his time and then those previous would have most likely had an idea about a knowledge, a revelation about a future bodily resurrection. Any questions on Job's statements here? Okay, so here early on we have revelation concerning a future physical bodily resurrection. Turn to Isaiah chapter 26. Isaiah chapter 26, and someone like to read verse 19. Okay? So what here tells us of a future resurrection? Yeah. Thy dead men shall live. That's a resurrection. And he's not talking here about a spiritual resurrection. He's talking about a physical, bodily resurrection, particularly for Israel. Prophet Isaiah is ministering to the nation of Israel, and he's telling them, he's giving them hope, encouragement, that thy dead men shall live one day. You're going to have a resurrection. And also at the end of the verse, he says, the earth shall cast out the dead. That's a resurrection. So the nation of Israel had the knowledge of a future resurrection of the dead. Turn to the book of Daniel, chapter 12. Yes.
That verse, are we positive that it's actually Isaiah speaking and not perhaps Jesus? Could it be Jesus speaking in this? It doesn't say the Lord, but...
Well, it's obviously Isaiah speaking, thus saith the Lord. I mean, a prophet spoke in the name of the Lord, so it's Isaiah speaking to the nation of Israel concerning what information God had given him.
I just wondered from verse 20 if that was the Lord speaking, though it didn't say it. So I just wondered in the context if that could be. It could be Isaiah saying, come my people, but maybe it's the Lord. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if you necessarily need to make a distinction there because, again, when a prophet spoke, it was as though God was speaking. And so he's simply passing on information that, God had given him directly to the nation. All right, let's go to Daniel 12. And someone like to read verses 1 through 3. All right, so where do we have a resurrection mentioned in these verses? Yeah, in verse number 2. Many of them that sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake. And of course, sleep, both in the Old and New Testament, the sleep can be used as a euphemism for death. We know Paul uses the word sleep in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 concerning the rapture, the resurrection that church saints are going to receive at the rapture. And he talks about those who have fallen asleep, those who we have known in the church age that have already died and they're now with the Lord. So he uses sleep there as a euphemism for death. And here the same. Those who are sleeping in the dust of the earth, they shall awake. That's a resurrection. That's a physical, bodily resurrection. And he mentions two kinds of resurrections. What are those two kinds in verse 2? Yeah, so two different kinds of resurrections, and an everlasting life resurrection and an everlasting contempt resurrection. And now Daniel chapter 12 gives us a hint concerning the timing of this specific resurrection. Now we're going to get into a little bit later, not today, but probably next week, we're going to get into the different resurrections and the timing. So there's not just one resurrection, there are actually three. three different resurrections, three different times. And Daniel 12 gives us a hint concerning this specific resurrection, and he's speaking primarily to Jewish people. And what is the hint in these verses? What is the hint, or where is the hint of the timing? Yeah, verse 1. And what's the hint that's given? Okay, at that time. Say it again. Okay, and what's that in reference to? The tribulation. Yeah. So at that time, now that goes back to chapter 11, namely toward the end of chapter 11, starting in verse 36, where he speaks in reference of this willful king, whom we believe is the Antichrist, and the war, that's the war scenario that's laid out there in verses 36 through 45, and he's dealing with a war scenario in the tribulation period, a time of Jacob's trouble, and in chapter 12, verse 1, at that time, meaning the time of this war scenario, which will happen again in the tribulation period, Michael's going to stand up, the great prince for Israel, particularly for the children of thy people, which is the Jewish people. And there's going to be a time of trouble, such as never was since there was a nation. Well, that's Matthew 24. Jesus uses that same phrase to refer to the tribulation, the 7-year tribulation period. And so then this resurrection, according to verse 2, in that context, this resurrection then will happen at the end of the tribulation period for the nation of Israel. So there's a hint concerning the timing of this particular resurrection. So 3 clear references in the Old Testament to a resurrection. So yes, God's people in the Old Testament weren't ignorant, or at least they didn't need to be ignorant concerning this hope. They didn't nearly have the information we have today, because we now have the completed New Testament, which sheds light on these resurrection passages, but they had this information given to them. So they had the hope of a coming physical bodily resurrection. Any questions on the general references to resurrection in the Old Testament? All right, let's look at the New Testament. We have 2 references to just their general resurrections. There's no specific details attached. Let's go to John, the Gospel of John, chapter 5. John chapter 5, and someone like to read verses 28 and 29. All right. Do we have, is that a reference to a physical bodily resurrection? Absolutely. Absolutely. And what are the 2 kinds of resurrections that Jesus mentions here? Yeah, what does what passage does that remind you of in the Old Testament? Yeah, Daniel 12. That's what Jesus is referencing here. He's referencing Daniel 12, 2 kinds of resurrections, a resurrection unto life and a resurrection unto eternal damnation. He doesn't specify anything here regarding timing. He just simply mentions 2 different kinds of resurrections. But there will be a time in the future when there will be a physical bodily resurrection. And then turn to John chapter 11. John chapter 11, and this is in reference to Jesus raising Lazarus from the dead. And notice what he says to Martha in John 11, 23 and 24. Or actually, read 23 through 26.
Jesus saith unto her, Thy brother shall rise again. Martha saith unto him, I know that he shall rise again in the resurrection at the last day. Jesus said unto her, I am the resurrection and the life. He that believeth in me, though he were dead, yet shall he live. And whosoever liveth and believeth in me shall never die. Believest thou this?
Okay, so notice what Martha says in verse 24. Did you catch that? When Jesus makes the statement, thy brother, he's referring to Lazarus, thy brother shall rise again. Now, Jesus obviously is specifically referencing the fact that he's about to raise him from the dead. But notice Martha's statement in verse 24. What are the first two words that she says? I know. She doesn't say, well, I think, or there's been some rabbis who have claimed. She says, I know. She's confident in this particular truth. I know that he shall rise again in the resurrection at the last day. Now, what reference do you think that she has in mind when she's saying this to Jesus? Pete? Job. Remember when we read Job chapter 19? And Job says there, I know my Redeemer lives, and that he shall stand at the latter day upon the earth. And then the very next verse, he talks about his own future physical bodily resurrection. He says, even though my body's going to die and be eaten with worms, etc., it's going to decay. He says, yet in my flesh shall I see God. And he makes that statement after he says, when the Redeemer stands on the earth on the latter day. And of course, we know the timing of that, according to Zechariah 14, that's going to be at the very end of the tribulation period. And according to Daniel 12, that's when the Jewish people are going to have their resurrection. So Martha is basing her belief on Job 19. Now, she also had Isaiah 26, and she also had Daniel chapter 12, which I'm sure she knew. But here specifically, she is referencing Job chapter 19. So she tells Jesus, I know that he's going to rise again in the latter day, because Job said so. She knew the book of Job was scripture. So she says, I know. She was confident. And so any Old Testament saint could have the confidence like Martha had that there was a future a physical bodily resurrection of the dead. And then, of course, Jesus makes his famous statement, that one of the I ams, one of the precious I ams of the Lord, I am the resurrection and the life. Okay, so two general references in the New Testament here concerning a future physical bodily resurrection of the dead. Any questions, comments on these general references? Now you might say, why is this important? We all know there's going to be a resurrection. Why is this important? Because most people in this world do not have a hope of a future resurrection. Various religions have their own ideas as to what's going to happen in the future. There are many that don't believe in a resurrection at all. They think that, we're going to die in this life sometime, and that's it. There's no life. There's no afterlife. There's no resurrection. Others have a odd idea of a resurrection, like the Hindus. I believe in, is it the Hindu? Do I have that right? The Hindus that believe in the reincarnation, that they're going to die and then they are going to come back to life someday as something, a cow maybe, or a mouse, or what have you. There are different thoughts there in that religion. And then, of course, you had, in Jesus' day, you had a group of religious people that didn't believe in a resurrection. Anybody remember what that group was? The Sadducees. The Sadducees didn't believe in a resurrection, and of course that's why their name is given, Sadducees. They didn't believe in a resurrection because they were sad, you see. That's about the best. See, Blake was good. He was firing them off last night, and that's about the best one I have. Blake?
I have a question sparked with John 5:29 and Daniel 12:2.
Mm-hmm.
How do you prove to somebody from these verses that, like Christians, they would say, well, there's just one general resurrection,
Right.
And then the good people are going to go to heaven, and the bad people are going to be condemned.
Right.
How would you argue that there are two resurrections, or at least two, maybe three?
Right. So you couldn't, in these general, you couldn't argue it in these general resurrection verses that we've looked at, in the 3 in the Old Testament and the 2 in the New, except for the Daniel 12. As there's the hint there concerning the nation of Israel, the timing of that. But as far as the timing of, as we're going to get into, the 3 different resurrections, 3 different kinds of resurrections, and the timing of that, you can't prove that based on these verses. You can't prove that based on John chapter 5. You can based on other passages that we'll look at a little bit later when we talk about the order of resurrections. And so it's putting all of the references together on resurrection to be able to then come to the conclusion that there are 3 different kinds of resurrections, and they'll be they're going to happen at different times, not at the same time. But that's a very common view, particularly amongst Reformed theology. Calvinists, they believe in, if they're true Calvinists, they believe in one general resurrection, where everyone, both saved and unsaved, are going to be resurrected. They don't believe in the, as we're going to look at, the 3 different resurrection timings. So they just believe one general resurrection. So that is a very common view. Pops?
I think it's important when we talk to people about Christ's resurrection that in the example of Lazarus and the widow's son and other times in the Old Testament, those people were resuscitated.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Lazarus had to pass through death again.
Yeah.
And he's still dead. So when it comes to Christ, he is the first fruits of the resurrection.
Mm-hmm.
Into a glorified body. That's a huge difference.
Yeah.
And I think it's important to point that out to
Right.
folks who've never heard this or don't believe it, or
Mm.
that there is a permanent resurrection, if you will,
Right.
versus a temporary one that happened a few times.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, good point to make, that yes, prior to the resurrection of Jesus Christ, all resurrections were temporary. They didn't have their glorified body, and they had to die again. And we have a number of occasions where people were raised from the dead. Jesus performed miracles. Some of the apostles raised the dead. That was one of the signs that Jesus gave them in Matthew chapter 10. Remember, he said, "Go out and tells them to heal the sick and also raise the dead." And then, of course, when Jesus died, you remember when the earthquake takes place. It says many came out of the tombs. I've always found that fascinating. That's all the information we have. It says they came out of the tombs and they walked into the city, and then that's it. And then the text goes on, and there's no explanation there. But obviously they had to die again because they weren't raised at the resurrection of Christ or after the resurrection of Christ. But yes, he is the first fruits And so you think about that in light of Lazarus. Like the resurrection of Lazarus really wasn't necessarily a good thing for him, right? It was good for Mary and Martha, their brother, as they get to see their brother again. You know, obviously Jesus did it as a miracle. He was proving who he was. But for Lazarus himself, it really wasn't a blessing for Lazarus to be raised again. And the main reason it wasn't a blessing for him is because he had to go through the whole process of dying again. Who wants to do that again? Especially if Lazarus didn't have a pleasant dying experience. You know, he was in pain or what have you in the last days of his life. And then, to think that he's raised again in, however many years he had, we're not told, if he had another 10, 20, 30 years, and he had to go through the whole process of dying again. So in one sense, it wasn't necessarily a blessing for those who were raised again, because Lazarus was fine where he was in Abraham's bosom. He was happy where he was, and then he had to come back to earth and deal with the aches and pains and everything else that we have to deal with in this life. Any other questions, comments, Mammy?
Sorry, I said I wasn't saying, but just reading this verse 23, it's interesting because we know that as Christians, there is a generation that will not go through that process of death.
Mm-hmm.
But you know what? When you read these verses, this verse here, 23, he that believeth in me, though he were dead, yet shall live. Okay, sorry, verse 26. And whosoever liveth and believeth in me shall never die.
Mm-hmm.
Believest thou this?
Mm-hmm.
There is a generation of the children of Israel that will never die. Because at the second coming of the Lord, there will be those Jewish believers, and they're not going to experience death either. They're going to go right into the kingdom. It was just a thought that I've never really thought about before, but I wonder, based on this verse here, whoever lives and believeth in me, who's living, they're living, shall never die.
Mm. Yeah.
It's not just Christians, it's a future generation, and they may be living right now.
Mm. Yeah, and that's one way to look at that, is those who are living at the time of the coming of the Lord, that are also believing, they are saved. Another way to look at verse 26 is in reference to any saved person, whether you're living at the time of the coming of the Lord, whether it's the rapture or whether you're a tribulation saint, you get saved in the tribulation and you make it to the end at Christ's second coming. But if you take that as just generally all saved people, the moment we die physically, that doesn't end it for us. So in one sense, we never die as believers, because we're never at one millisecond ever separated from the Lord. Because to be absent from the body is what? Present with the Lord. You don't die and then an hour later you're present with the Lord, or 2 days later, you're present with the Lord. To be absent from the body is to be present with the Lord. The moment you take your last breath on earth is your first breath in heaven. So there's no separation at all from the time of physical death to the time of being present with the Lord. So that's another way to look at it. I've always been kind of fascinated with verse 26 because he asked Martha, do you believe this? And my response is, well, I believe it, but I don't fully understand it. So those maybe are two ways to look at verse 26, is exactly what is he really talking about there. Any other questions, comments? All right, we'll end here, and we'll pick up next week on looking at Christ's resurrection, how his resurrection was predicted in the Old Testament, some of the messianic prophecies concerning his not only death but his resurrection, and how he on earth predicted his own resurrection, and then look at the witness of the resurrection of Christ, because our future resurrection depends entirely on the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And Paul would make that point very clear in 1 Corinthians 15. If Christ didn't rise from the dead, then there's no resurrection for us. But he did rise again. And so we have the blessed hope of a future physical bodily resurrection. All right, let's close in prayer. Father, thank you for these references you have given to us, these general references concerning a future physical bodily resurrection from the dead. We thank you for the comfort that these references give us, and help us as we continue looking at this subject to be encouraged and to be thankful for the future resurrection that we'll experience one day. In Jesus' name we pray, amen.